Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Votiro and Novacoast webinar. We'll give everyone a few minutes to get settled, and we'll get started in a minute or so. Hope everyone's having a fun Tuesday. Nice and warm down here in Cedar Park, Texas, and very close to Austin. It's actually pretty hot. What about you, Tyler?
Uh, so I'm out in Ojai in California. We are getting a glimpse of fall, but we'll have another heat wave after this. It's but it's definitely it's been last few weeks. It was in the 90s, broke 100, so we're under 70 now, which is pretty phenomenal.
We're still deep into summer down here.
Yeah.
So
What's hot for you? What's the weather like?
Well, normal here is 96, 97. Hot is in the 110s, but that's
Yeah. Yeah, we usually have a couple of our hottest days in September and October. So this is the time of year where it just kind of wildly fluctuates between a little bit of chill and hot. And so we enjoy the fall days when we can still get them.
Exactly. I see that people are coming in, it's settling down. I think we can get started.
Sure.
So let's get started. So my name is Eric Avigdor. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Votiro. We are a data detection and response company. We do a whole lot of very cool, interesting things, which we'll tell you about in a moment. And I'd like to introduce Tyler Johnson from Novacoast. Do you want to tell us, Tyler, about your background?
Yeah. Hi. So my name is Tyler Johnson. I'm a director of advisory services and customer success here at Novacoast. So Novacoast is an IT professional services company. We have a long history as a security company, first and foremost, providing consulting services for IT security and managed services.
Perfect. And we'll be going back and forth, hoping to provide some insight, some interesting insight into how to deal with PCI-DSS compliance, which is not an easy feat. And I think to just frame the problem, where I'd like to start is with thinking about where we are today versus where we were several years ago,
Mhm.
10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. When you think about compliance, PCI DSS and we'll talk about this in much more detail in a few minutes, as a compliance that really talks about very specific types of data that need to be stored and handled in a very specific manner. You really need to think about how that data moves throughout your network and your environment. And in the past, that was maybe not an easy task, but it was a fairly well-defined task. You had your network, the castle and moat corporate network structure. Your data was there and it couldn't leave that environment. And you had a list of things you had to do to keep that data safe. But the world has dramatically and completely changed in the past 20 years. You go onto any webinar nowadays, everyone will tell you about the fact that data is the new oil and that data is everywhere. It's no longer on premise. It's in the cloud, it's in applications, it's in SaaS environments and web portals and everywhere. But that great advantage which the digital world and cloud has brought to our commerce and to our ability to deliver services is making compliance much more difficult. Not only PCI, but PCI is one of the ones which is just becoming exponentially more difficult. So, where I want to start with framing the problem is where we really start every discussion that we have with new prospects, new companies we talk to at Votiro, which is think about all the data your organization has. It's a massive amount of data, but 80% of that data comes in the form of unstructured data, files. So maybe when you think about a PCI environment, you'd be thinking about maybe loan applications or credit card applications or any type of document that could contain credit card holder data. And when you think about all of the environments that we interact within nowadays, so email with attachments and collaboration tools like Teams or Slack, cloud storage, if you think about your OneDrive and SharePoint or Box or Dropbox and your data management tools and web applications and SaaS applications, that data exists in all of these environments. And that kind of complicates things because if you now want to protect that data and ensure that you are still within compliance with PCI, potentially there's a lot of work to do.
Mhm.
Begs a very important question. If as a company, you'd like to safeguard and protect that private data, that PCI data, and with the challenge that nowadays IT environments and applications are much more complex than they used to be, are we still in the right spot with taking that cycle-based approach, which says, let's stop everything once a year in, mid-November, or, come up with your own compliance date? Should we stop everything in that point in time, evaluate our compliance, fix our compliance posture, audit it, and report on it? Should that be a recurring thing that happens every year? And again, we spend a lot of time and effort and money and headcount on doing that, versus should we find a more clever way or a more automated way to remain in compliance always? Because if we could do that, we could potentially save a whole lot of time and effort on the teams that invest a lot of time in compliance.
Mhm.
So, can we remove the pain of audits? Can we do that in an automated way so we can focus our IT and cybersecurity efforts in things that are potentially also important? Before we start talking about the how, I'm just framing the problem now, and I want to bring up a concept comes from the PCI world. And this cyclic process, which is described in PCI as the assess, repair, report process, let's talk about that for a moment, because the idea here is really, if you're new to PCI or if you've been doing it for years, you'll come across this concept that says you first need to find where all of your data is and where the vulnerabilities potentially could be for that data. Then you need to repair, you need to fix if that data is not allowed to reside in that environment, we need to fix that somehow, delete it, obfuscate it, and repair all of the vulnerabilities that could make that data more vulnerable to exfiltration or insider threat or just
Mhm.
simple negligence and mistakes. And then how do we report on it? But it doesn't end there, because then we need to reassess, re-repair, and re-report every single year. So how do we take that process, make it easy? With that said, I'd like to hand things over back to you, Tyler, and ask, we have we're lucky with PCI. The
Yeah.
PCI defines very, very well what you need to do with different types of data. So walk us through, what can be stored, what can't be stored, what should be encrypted. Is encryption the silver bullet that solves everything, or kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, at the end of the day, PCI it's a data security standard. So the data we're concerned about is, obviously in this case, cardholder data. So it's not just about how you accept data. It's not just the protecting your card readers or the transactions, but it's managing the full life cycle of that cardholder data and understanding that there's different parts to it. So we have if you look at the screen here, so we have the primary account number. That's the traditional credit card, number that you're going to see. But there's a lot of other types. So there's the expiration date and service codes and cardholder name. But then you have like the track data, the magnetic data stored on the card, and other types of sensitive authentication data that except for a very few exceptions made for card issuers, most merchants, you're just strictly not allowed to store this information after authorization. So in a lot of these cases, no, like encryption will not save you. Encryption may be required as a protective measure, but that adds a whole extra set of responsibilities for managing keys, managing, when can you decrypt the data, who's in charge of safeguarding that data. So it really opens up a whole can of worms of you have to understand, manage, and maintain a full life cycle for this data, and knowing what you're allowed to keep, where you're allowed to keep it, and how it's allowed to be transmitted.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point that, when we used to think about PCI in the past, we really used to think about physical security, identity security, encryption, these big things, many of which are still very relevant.
Yeah,
But
they're not gone
yeah,
away. It's been
I'm
added.
just thinking with this new modern world that we're in, potentially there is a next level of automation that is required.
Hmm. Yeah, no,
And yeah, go ahead.
oh, just absolutely to your point of none of the old challenges have left. Uh, it's if you look at the high level view of PCI, physical security is still there, network security is still there, but as the world that we live in has gotten more complex with hybrid environments and full cloud environments and more bespoke software companies, the ways we have to implement the controls to keep that data safe has gotten significantly more complicated.
Right. And I think, as the market has evolved, and so has the concept of zero trust, which is a big part of how we keep our data safe, I think we're narrowing down on the real problem, which is the problem is no longer only at the network level and no longer even at the identity level. It is
Mhm.
now down at the data level. And we need to figure out smart ways to apply zero trust principles to the data itself, where the perimeter is really the data itself.
Mhm.
And with that, if we want to start to talk about potentially how we could make PCI compliance easier, we will take a three-step approach, obviously. Everything good comes in three steps. So we'll take a three-step approach, and we'll first look at determining scope, but we're going to use the idea of treating PCI data as if it is radioactive, right? It is radioactive, which means if it is placed in the wrong places and is not secured in the wrong place, it will contaminate other environments with radioactive material, and as such needs to be treated with utmost care. So with that, before we even dig into how to determine scope, tell us a little bit, Tyler, about PCI scopes. How do these work? What is that concept?
Yeah, so the radioactive analogy is great because the core of PCI is that so you have your cardholder data, and the controls apply to any systems that either store, uh, transmit, or process credit card data. They also apply to any systems that are on the same network as systems that store, process, or transmit credit card data. They also apply, so that's your core cardholder data environment. Then the controls also apply to any systems that could affect the security of one of those other systems. So as you can see, if you don't have very strict controls around it, your scope just keeps growing. If you're looking at a traditional from 15 years ago environment where you have a flat network and you've put a single device onto that network that can accept or store credit card information, you've now brought the entire company into scope for that assessment, which is generally not the ideal state for compliance. You want to try and minimize that scope as much as possible.
Right. And I think, this is something that many people overlook a bit, and I think it's super important to determine that scope in a way that makes the exercise doable, right? If your scope is too big, you'll be spending years over years in trying to prove compliance and reprove compliance, and it never ends, right? So that scope definition is a critical step. And something definitely both Votiro and Novacoast, with this great partnership, can help with. And I'd like to segue into, okay, so now that we understand scope as something that is, we've decided as a company that this is the scope of where we're allowing PCI data to reside. And because of that, this is the scope of or environment that we would be monitoring and tracking and controlling and remediating, I think the first question that really begs me is how do you even determine that scope? How do you
Hmm.
decide what is in or out of scope?
Yeah. Well, like you mentioned before, the best processes have 3 steps. So, uh, the first way to do it is you really have to identify all of your ingress points. And being the nature of credit card information, this could be physical. This could be, if you're accepting physical credit cards, uh, so physical, electronic with e-commerce, and any other types. If you're taking phone orders, mail orders, if you are a service provider that is accepting credit cards on behalf of a third party that maybe you didn't take the credit card, but identifying all of those ingress points for how credit card information could get into your environment is the first step.
Mhm.
The second step is you need to map the data flows and the data lifecycle. So once that data is into your environment, where does it live and how does it need to be handled? In many environments, the data doesn't stay in one spot. It may come in through one channel, be stored in another, need to be reused for ongoing, maybe subscriptions or ongoing payments. Um, so you need to understand the full life cycle of that data. And then finally, once you understand that, you need to evaluate the segmentation that you can implement and any other mitigating techniques. Could be outsourcing, uh, falling back to tokenization, implementing point-to-point encryption. But first, you need to understand what is the business need for this data, and then you can start building the walls around it to isolate it and to really minimize that scope for what your actual cardholder data environment is going to look like.
Yeah, when I think about kind of the way you describe scope, I'm thinking about thousands of credit unions in North America, which have lately been asked kindly by the NCUA to become PCI compliant within the next 2 years. And when thinking about scope, I think, especially the credit unions who don't have the massive IT infrastructure that maybe a large bank might have, it is
Mm-hmm.
extremely important to very well define your scope before taking on that effort to become PCI compliant. Otherwise, this can become a massive exercise, which can be overwhelming for a credit union. Um, so kind of moving on to that next step, you've described scope, and if I think back to that original view of that we started the session with, where everywhere where files exist. So let's just describe a very simple use case. Let's say I have a credit union and there's a loan application or a credit card application coming in through maybe a third-party facing web portal. So we have a customer portal where applications can be uploaded. That file that contains PCI data, potentially maybe a credit card number on it, will then land in maybe a data lake or a cloud repository and will then be downloaded by a user who is processing that application. So as the application is being processed, you could suddenly be potentially surprised by what your users are doing, which you may not know. For example, are they then taking that application and sending it over email as an attachment, or sending it over a Teams or Slack message to someone, or uploading it into a OneDrive or SharePoint location in order to share with someone else? Suddenly, that data sprawl, you have this seemingly innocent document suddenly finding its way into everywhere in your organization. And what does this mean for scope, right? How do we contain that scope so it doesn't grow, and then we need to put in more controls in place. So I think if we want to kind of bring this first point to at least some conclusion, I'd say, first we've identified that we need to identify ingress points. Ingress points as in entry points where sensitive data, PCI data, can be coming into my environment. Those obviously could be different SaaS applications, web applications, email attachments, but just create a visual map of everywhere where PCI data could enter the organization. And as an immediate continuation of that, what would that data flow look like internally? What would the life cycle of that data look like? If that data came in through here, where could it land in the next few minutes or in the next few years or months? It is extremely important to identify the routes which that data can take, which is something we call data lineage, where the data originated from, where it landed, and what are the variants of that data and where it falls. And then that then leads us to the question of how do we enforce the scope? Now, I just want to go back to something we mentioned a few minutes ago. We've kind of quickly skimmed over this, but email is a pretty well understood problem that we've been talking about for years, right? Cloud storage, maybe we've been talking about for the past few years, but collaboration tools, many companies have started using collaboration tools lately, and this specific mode of data exchange has dramatically changed how different types of risk should be addressed. And Tyler, I'd like to ask you kind of just for your take on platforms like Teams and Slack, how do they make PCI compliance more difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the challenges with those is that really anything outside of a traditional putting the data on a server is considered an end user technology. So there's a requirement under I think it's requirement 422 has additional restrictions for if you want to send anything via a end user messaging technology. So that can include SMS, that can include chat, email, any kind of instant messaging. And so in those situations, because of the kind of the associated risks of these are usually less well managed technologies that you have to put strong encryption around that. So depending on what you're talking about, many organizations don't encrypt all of their email. And so, you don't necessarily encrypt, things like text messaging can be impossible to encrypt unless you use additional controls. And so the first is securing the platforms. But then the second challenge with them is that by their nature, they tend to not be managed by IT or infrastructure. So you needed to find a way for knowing when the data could get into those mediums, and then how do you dynamically protect it? Or do you go through the effort of, most organizations don't want to say, okay, every email we're ever going to send has to be encrypted from now on. It's just not a feasible solution.
And you know what? That's such a great point. And we're coming across this challenge again and again and again in different aspects within cybersecurity and data security, which is, you think about IT as that central point, that command center that really can look at everything, know everything, have controls over everything. But many of the new modern tools are actually not in the hands of IT. Many of these tools are now in the hands of the business lines and compliance teams and
or worse.
shadow IT. Exactly. Yeah. How do you put controls over all of that? So there's actually there's good hope. We're bringing some good hope in that space, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. So we talked about defining the scope, and now that we know what the scope is, we know what we need, where we need to put controls, and where we need to hopefully enforce controls. But how do you enforce your scope? How do you ensure that if you put that private data, that PCI data in that radioactive, bunker, how do you keep it there? And how do you ensure that nothing else leaks out of that environment? So before we tackle the techniques and technicalities around how that is done, could you share with us, Tyler, just let's say I'm new to PCI, right? And I've just been hit by NCUA telling me I have to be PCI compliant. There is a lot of requirements in there. Let's talk about kind of the big building blocks of PCI.
Yeah. So at its core, PCI it's a full security framework. So it's not something where you're only looking at just physical security, or you're only looking at like how do you secure your servers. It's easier to think of it something as more in line with something like NIST, where it has people, process, and technology components. So we have our 12 main requirements. but those 12 requirements have over 250 different controls. So when you're getting to the enforce stage, you're really looking at, okay, we've established scope. Now we have to apply everything to our whole environment. And so the reason that we spend so much time on scope is that if you can reduce your scope, you can take some of these controls out. Depending on the type of environment you have, you could be looking at anywhere from the full 250 plus controls to maybe only having to implement, 25 of them. And that's obviously an enormous difference. But for, complex environments that may not be able to do that, it's a full framework where you need to be looking at, people can be in scope. Your governance program is in scope. There's risk management portions. And, if software, there's full SDLC criteria that you have to meet if you're doing bespoke software. And so it's a big program.
It definitely is a big program. And I'd like to maybe propose something, as in the lines of along the lines of what we do in Votiro on an approach that can help with many of these controls. And that is something that is now, it's a new term. It's a fairly new term in the market from roughly the past year or two.
Mm-hmm.
And what this is something called data detection and response. Now, if we think back to, past 20 or 30 years, controls were separated, really very well aligned with something along the lines of the 12 different controls that we saw right now, right? So preventing malware was one thing, and preventing risk in general and tracking risk. And then data protection was one thing, encryption was one thing, data discovery was another thing. Detecting threat on the endpoint was separate from detecting it at the network level. Identity and access management controls for adding multi-factor authentication and access controls, and how does single sign-on apply for all of that. So there were many, many, many different technologies that all in a band-aid fashion solved a single problem. Data detection and response is an entirely different approach because it brings into play several different areas, looking at the problem not from a tool perspective, but more from a how do we solve this problem with less tools. And I'll give an example. There are several different ways to exfiltrate data, and we want to make sure that the PCI data we have doesn't leak or isn't exfiltrated or doesn't mistakenly leave the company, the organization. So you could look at the different types of potential risks. For example, malicious hacker comes in, deploys malware, exfiltrates data. Or malicious hacker comes in, deploys malware to harvest credentials, which are then used for an identity-based attack. Or malicious hacker comes in, doesn't deploy malware, but attacks you with a phishing attack, which later on leads to deployment of malware or an identity-based attack, right? There are many different modes. Same could be told about an insider who could potentially decide one day to resign while at the same time grabbing 5,000 files with PCI data and sharing them on the dark web, right? So there are many, many different modes of attack. But what is common to all of these is that one of the most important tools that initiates these attacks is malware being deployed. A second way to look at that problem is that if you could put more granular controls, again, taking that zero trust approach down to the smallest possible perimeter, which is the data itself, you could potentially prevent that data from leaving to where it shouldn't. So how do you do that? Data detection and response says, look, the good old days where we used DLP for data loss prevention and DSPM for finding all of the problems where data exists. These technologies are awesome, or were awesome at what they did for that world as it was. Nowadays, when these types of technologies, such as DLP and DSPM and endpoint detection and response to prevent malware, all of these great technologies are basically putting a workload and a stressor on IT that says, here are a lot of problems that need to be solved. And while they do that perfectly, Now the IT team is stretched to say, how do I go remediate all of these problems? So now it becomes this zero-sum game of, okay, if I can solve 12% of the problems, maybe I'm in a good enough situation. Data detection and response takes a different approach, which says, if we can prevent the problem in the first place, then these great tools, these monitoring tools that are still in place will find less problems, which means we will need to spend less time on manually remediating the problems.
Mm-hmm.
An example would be data detection and response within Votiro uses an incredibly, almost magical technology called content disarm reconstruction, which allows you to make files safe from malware, ransomware, zero-day attacks in a much more efficient way than any one of the other detection-based tools could, which means that we're preventing malware, ransomware from coming in the first place and exfiltrating data. The same exact thing can be said for data privacy and data protection. If instead of waiting for that data to be exfiltrated, or instead of chasing ghosts and searching for that data everywhere within scope and finding it and remediating it and deleting it and removing that database and removing access to people who shouldn't have access through identity sprawl, if instead of that, we could remediate that data by masking and obfuscating it, redacting it before it lands where it shouldn't, there'd be less cleanup that we could actually do. And you know, Tyler, I mean, you've been in this space for many, many, many years. I mean, you know how hard it is to clean up the mess once the mess is done. Give me your thoughts on kind of how that preventative approach could really benefit an organization.
Yeah. So I mean, there's multiple ways to look at it. You know, if for the people that are just trying to check a box and be done with PCI, this can really reduce your overall risk threshold for a lot of those areas. So in some of these areas, you may be able to replace some of the existing controls with a customized approach, where something new in PCI-4 is, if you have a tool such as this, where you can say, I know that the defined approach says XYZ, we're actually going above and beyond. We're not doing things on a weekly basis or a monthly basis or scanning it and then sending it to our SOC. We actually have a tool that is dynamically doing this in real time. That can significantly reduce the workload that you have to put forward to meet a lot of these controls. And then for the organizations that are not just interested in checking the box, you need to understand that PCI, like any control framework, any security framework, it's the minimum. It's this is the bare minimum. So by having one of these, I think we've moved on, but for lack of a better word, the next generation technologies, around data protection, you're adding additional safeguards on top of how you manage this data. And that falls very much in line with what one of the big changes, kind of holistically, from moving from PCI 3.2.1 that we were on last year to the new version 4, is this idea of we are taking a risk-based approach to security. We're moving away from strict technical controls, and we're getting to, there's now 11 different, it's a targeted risk analysis that you have to perform for different parts of your environment. And so being able to bring in something that can more dynamically address that risk is exactly in line with the direction that the industry is headed.
That's, I love the point, because there's just so much data out there nowadays. Every company has so much data out there that if you will try to use that same old approach, which is put controls on everything, it's a losing game. I mean,
it's hard. Yeah.
It is very hard. So I think what data detection and response and Votiro together with Novacoast, what we bring to the table is that preventative approach, which happens in real time. And the more we can remediate in real time, the less work we need to do on the day-to-day basis, and the more we can claim that we are now continuously compliant. Now, this brings us to kind of step three, which is we obviously should not underestimate the effort that is required to prove to an auditor that you're PCI compliant and to maintain that compliance, which can be an effort. So you have that, radioactive material that's in the bunker. You need to keep assessing and checking and testing that none of it left that bunker and it is still safe in there and it didn't leak and we're all safe, right? So how do we put controls on that? And for that, one of the nice things about data detection and response is that the Votiro platform as an example of that would continuously not only remediate the problem, it would not only remove that malware, it won't only mask that data so it doesn't end up where it shouldn't. Imagine, a file being downloaded from that third-party facing portal. That loan application is now being shared over Teams or Slack, and data can be, because data will be masked, sensitive data will be masked as it moves in real time. Individuals who are not allowed to see that data because they don't have the privilege will simply not be exposed to it. So tracking that actually becomes a fairly, I won't say easy, but an easier exercise. Because now, okay, so you have visibility into what's moving along. You can easily prove that the data is reaching only where it should reach and never leaves that scope that we talked about. When you find that exception on, oh, hey, this user found a really interesting way to circumvent my controls, then analytics come into play and they show you the anomaly. You can come back, adjust the policy, and your data detection and response automated remediation basically cycles back to keeping you safe and compliant in real time. I know we're pretty much up on time. Any final thoughts on this, Tyler, before we go to our Q&A section?
Yeah, so I think that one of the places that Votiro fits in really well is it reflects the changing attitudes in the industry. Like I talked about before, we're moving from here's a checklist of controls, and we're moving to that risk-based approach that's supposed to be really looking at what is your business trying to achieve and how can you do it in a safe and compliant manner that is dynamic with your organization. And so can you get away with, doing the point in time solution right now? You probably can, but it's going to keep getting harder because it's not really I don't want to say in the spirit of, but it's not in line with really just what risk management in the industry, like not from a marketing perspective, but from what we're realizing actually is effective. Attackers are creative, and you need to look at, I'm sure a lot of people who are in IT and security can emphasize, you need to look at what is the actual business need that you're trying to prevent or trying to protect rather.
And you mentioned earlier, organizations trying to check a box, right?
Mm-hmm.
A compliance box. I think I'm seeing, more and more organizations are realizing with all of the different attacks lately, one thing is compliance as a checkbox, a whole different thing is their own reputation. If you're a small credit union or a small bank and you've been breached and all of that private data, your credit card data, your cardholder data is out there and exposed, that's a significant reputation damage, which in many cases leads to significant business loss. I am seeing one question, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I saw a couple of questions on what if we have DLP in place already, or we have endpoint detection in place. Is it still worth thinking about a data detection and response or approach, or are we good to go?
So I'll give the auditor answer of it depends, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Both from there's the easy answer for a yes is, yeah, obviously you want to have more defense in depth. You want to have the more proactive, approach. But even from a strictly business approach, if you're just looking at the dollars and cents, Um, think about, if you have a solution now that can cross multiple verticals within your environment, that can help tie different departments together, and it can do it in a way where maybe you can use one tool to meet 4 or 5 other controls that previously required multiple tools. So I think there's a lot of different reasons to look at this. There's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out of the industry right now, where people are, the technology is giving us the chance to do things that just we couldn't support before. And as these new tools come out, and as we look at these really creative solutions to things, it's always worth looking at how can we better secure our environment.
Fully agreed. And that resonates with me a lot. I think, the approach we take and everything, the philosophy we use in Votiro is we want to make data protection and easier for, for our customers.
Yeah.
We want to automate as much as possible and remove manual work from your desk. If you'd like to learn more, there's the info@votiro.com email, which you can reach out for a one-on-one discovery session. We can help you out with PCI risk and processes. And obviously, with our great partners at Novacoast, we'll be more than happy to help. Thanks, Tyler, for this great discussion. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I hope everyone else did.
Yeah. And if anyone has any questions for me, so I'm also the lead QSA here at Novacoast. And I just wanted to mention that, we can really help you wherever you're at on your PCI journey. So obviously, as a QSA company, we help people with assessments, both the full report on compliance as well as assisting with self-assessments. But we can also, if you're newer in your journey here, we can help you build that program and learn how you should be structuring, how you can reduce the scope. And if you're running into roadblocks, we have a very deep engineering bench where we can come in and we can help you remediate your issues, or we can help you implement controls. So happy to chat with anybody who needs help, and always interested in just making the industry a safer place.
Absolutely. I hope everyone has an amazing Tuesday and a great rest of your week, and see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Eric.